Hello, fellow YouTubers and Planeswalkers. Welcome back to MadCity MTG. My name is Alex, and this is episode 2 in the Modern Deck Tech series. And I'm actually filming this less than 24 hours before the banned and restricted update comes out on Monday, July 13th. And the deck I'm going to show you could actually be greatly affected by the update, and remains to be seen, obviously. But I actually kind of figured it'd be a cool idea if something does get banned from this particular deck, that I would do a follow-up video and update the list and try to just reformat it a little bit and then bring an updated deck tech. So, but before all that happens, before the update comes out, we'll talk about the current deck as it stands because it's a lot of fun to play. And I really hope it actually doesn't get affected, but we'll see. So, without further ado, it is Yorion, Sky Nomad. So, Companion, most of you are probably pretty familiar, but I'll run through it real quick. So, your starting deck contains at least 20 cards more than the minimum deck size. So, being Modern, my 60-card deck is an 80-card deck, and he is, I can basically start with him in the Companion zone. I can pay 3 colorless, at sorcery speed, put him into my hand, and then cast him for 5 more mana. And he's a 4/5 flying bird serpent. When he enters the battlefield, which is the key ability here, exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control. Return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So he basically comes in and blinks or flickers a bunch of permanents that I have, non-land permanents, and just creates a ton of value. So keep that in mind as we kind of cruise through the rest of the deck. His ability. So I'll start with permanents because that's what Yorion is all about. And actually, I'm sorry, I'll start with non-creature permanents. So we've got one card that could potentially get banned right away, which is Arcum's Astrolabe. Again, if you follow Modern, this card is all over the place, so I understand it. The argument for banning it or wanting to ban it, but at the same time, I don't think it's that terrible. You're restricted to snow lands, so that's why there's so many snow-covered lands. It fixes mana, it draws cards, it's an artifact. It's fun to use, and I don't think it really warps the format too much. So it also kind of keeps Blood Moon in check, which is good. But anyway, the card itself, when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Really important. Obviously with Yorion's blinking ability. And then I can tap a colorless, tap it, and add 1 mana of any color to my mana pool. So good mana fixer, good early card draw. Never hate playing an Astrolabe on turn 1. All right, next up in the permanent, non-creature permanent category is Omen of the Sea. Another new card, or newer card. 2 mana enchantment, but it has flash. When Omen of the Sea enters the battlefield, scry 2, then draw a card. 2 colorless and a blue, sacrifice Omen of the Sea, scry 2. So basically, this is a preordain at instant speed for 1 more mana in Modern. That can also be flickered or blinked with Yorion to get the ability again. So really, really good card, especially in a control deck like this where you're holding up counter magic, your opponent doesn't do anything relevant, so at the end of their turn you get some value by flashing this in and starting to establish your board a little bit. And not to mention it has another ability, just in case something drags out and you need to get rid of it. Go ahead and pay 3 mana and get a little bit more value out of it, or card selection. So really cool addition to the deck. All right, then we'll get into counter magic. So we've got 4 copies of Remand. Super fun card in this deck. One of my favorite Modern cards overall, as you'll find out with the more deck techs I do. But just a really, really good tempo card. Slows up the opponent while you try to establish your board and get going. And is really effective in this deck. Follow that up with 2 Archmage's Charm. And again, these numbers aren't totally set in stone. I could definitely see having a 3rd copy of Archmage's Charm in the deck. But for now, just got the 2, and it does work really well. There's a lot of synergy with the different abilities that it has. I guess I can run through them real quick. So 3 blue, and you get to choose 1, counter target spell. Target player draws 2 cards, or gain control of target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 1 or less. So versatility is the name of the game with Archmage's Charm. And then to follow that up, in the 3-drop slot, we have a full playset of Force of Negation. So this card is amazing in this deck. We generate a ton of card value or card advantage, so you always have a card to pitch to Force of Negation, and really it's just there to stop the super degenerate decks that are trying to combo off super early. Maybe you try to remand something, they go to counter it, and to save their combo or whatever, and then you force it, and you come out ahead of that. And you might be down a couple cards, but the point is that you didn't lose the game. So that's the goal with Force of Negation, is not losing the game. Also protects some of your other cards later that you'll find from removal, which is really important with some of the creatures that we play. And then finally, rounding out the counterspell suite is one of the best in Modern. Cryptic Command, can't say enough about this card. Colorless and 3 blue, also very versatile. Counter target spell, I choose 2 instead of just 1. Counter target spell, return target permanent to its owner's hand, or tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. So, if you follow Modern, you're probably pretty familiar with Cryptic Command and how amazing it is. Next up will be creatures. And in this deck, we've got a lot of creatures, so it's a lot of fun to play. Obviously, we've got a lot of backup to help those creatures extend the game. But early game, we've got a Boreal Grazer as a 3 of. Originally was a 4, but I found that sometimes late game, despite how many lands we run in this big deck, we really didn't get a ton of late game value out of this guy when we were blinking it with Yorion. So I added a 3rd copy of a different card that basically always gets value off Yorion. Otherwise, it just felt kind of weak to blink this guy. He's great turn 1, turn 2, but otherwise, if you're blinking in late game, he's not that effective. Okay, next up is 4 Gilded Goose. So, and I'm sorry, a Boreal Grazer, if you're not familiar, basically when he comes into play, he's an 0-3 with reach, so good blocker. When he enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, so just ramps us early in the game. And then next up is Gilded Goose, another early ramp card. Also has an enter the battlefield ability that works really well with Yorion if he gets flickered later in the game. So he's a 0-2 with flying, so we can really stop early game flyers. We got the early actual flyer, and then we've got a Boreal Grazer who has reach. So pesky little decks that like to get at you in the air are pretty much going to be stopped dead in their tracks. So, 0-2 flyer, when he enters the battlefield, create a food token. I can tap a colorless and a green and tap it to create another food token, and then tap and sacrifice a food and add 1 mana of any color. So, does a variety of things, and again, also works well with Yorion. Next up, we've got another Modern Horizons favorite that you see often with things like Archmage's Charm and Astrolabe, and that's Icefang Kotal. 1 green and 1 blue. He's a flying, flashing snake, so you can play him at instant speed as a blocker, or just end of your opponent's turn to get some value, because when he enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And then it also has Death Touch as long as you control at least 3 other snow permanents. So usually that's going to be, 2 or 3 lands, or I'm sorry, 3 lands or 2 lands plus an Astrolabe, or maybe just another Icefang Kotal on the board. So really good creature. Obviously works well with Yorion late game, blinking the Kotal, getting some value by drawing another card, that sort of thing. Also considered as a 4 of in a lot of decks, but I actually tried to include a little bit more variety in the creature package here, and you'll see next with this particular card, and that is Eternal Witness. So really good card in terms of blinking with Yorion. It's good early to get back like a fetch land or a counterspell. It's good late game to get back something better like Cryptic Command, or one of the bigger creatures if they happen to get killed. But basically, Eternal Witness for a colorless and 2 green. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So it doesn't get much better than that as far as value. Instead of just randomly drawing a card, you get to pick which card you want to get back into your hand late in the game. So that is a 2 of. There's also a potential lock with if you have a ton of mana with Eternal Witness and Cryptic Command, they work very similar to like the Cryptic Command lock with Mystic Sanctuary, which we'll get into, of course, in a little bit. And then we've got Kitchen Finks, another card that doesn't show up in a lot of these decks, but I think is actually amazing in this deck. Basically is a great early game blocker, of course. Gains you that 2 life back because we're going to be aggressively fetching for shock lands, even though there's only breeding pool in the deck. We're still going to be bolting ourselves by fetching and shocking, or fetching for a shock land early in the game, pretty much every game. So Kitchen Finks helps to offset that life loss, plus obviously against super aggressive decks that might get out ahead of our bigger, bulkier creatures that I'll show you in a second. Just provides that kind of mid-range game to keep you alive. And of course, you get basically 4 bodies out of it, if you think about it. So when Kitchen Finks comes into play, you gain 2 life, but it has Persist. So when this creature is put into a graveyard from play, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to play under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So let's say you block, the Kitchen Finks dies, it's going to come back, it's going to gain you another 2 life. So that's 4 life it's gained you, and it's blocked a creature. Then, if you get to blink it with a Yorion, it's going to flicker from the battlefield and come back. It's going to lose that -1/-1 counter, and it's basically going to reset itself. So you get another 2 life, and then if they happen to kill it again, it's going to come back yet again, for the 4th time, basically, gaining another 2 life, and then still provides a body. So Kitchen Finks, hard to get rid of in this deck. Unless they have some main deck graveyard hate, he's going to stick around and cause your opponent a lot of trouble. Then we get into the finishers of the deck. And this is another concern as far as the banned and restricted update for tomorrow. Our good buddy Euro, amazing card, colorless, green, blue, legendary Elder Giant. When he enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. And we'll get into escape in a second, but when he enters the battlefield, or it enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life and draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So essentially, and then escape. For 2 green and 2 blue, I can exile 5 other cards from my graveyard, and then basically cast it from the graveyard. Again, if you play Modern, you're probably very familiar with Euro. He's all over the place, or it's all over the place, and I think it's great for the format. It's essentially it's a 3-mana sorcery that ramps you and gains you some life. Obviously, it has there's a lot of tricks involved with it. Escape is great. It has created different types of decks and different ways to build these Simic decks. And I just really think it's a good card for the format. I don't think it's a terrible card, even though it shows up in a lot of decks. I don't think it's super oppressive. Again, you're casting a sorcery often with this card, and it's a sorcery, basically. It's not even the 6/6 beater until you escape it. So if you're really scared of a 3-mana sorcery in Modern, I don't know what you're expecting from the format. Just because a card is good and it's played a lot doesn't mean it needs to be banned. Lightning Bolt was the most popular card in Modern for years, and no one ever said ban Lightning Bolt. And it showed up in a ton of different archetypes, a ton of different decks. It's an amazingly versatile card. Everybody loves Lightning Bolt. Nobody ever says ban Lightning Bolt. And I'm not saying this is Lightning Bolt, but at the same time, just because a card is played a lot and it's good, it doesn't mean you have to ban it. So hopefully this sticks around. Hopefully I don't have to update the deck and take that card out, because it's a lot of fun to play. Now we get into a little bit more of the spice. A lot of this build is probably pretty familiar so far for people who are on board with the Simic decks in Modern, especially Yorion. A lot of people splash white. Obviously Yorion is blue and white, but I went the Simic route, even though there is, I guess, a little bit of bant here with Kitchen Finks. But again, it's all blue-green. And I do like a lot of the popular lists. I understand where they're coming from, and they maybe even want to go with the Scape Shift route, which is a great play. I have a Scape Shift deck. I love Scape Shift, and it's definitely tempting to kind of morph or reformat this deck into that strategy. But really what drew me into wanting to make this deck was the combination of these next two creatures in the same deck, and I felt that this shell was a good way to go, with having 80 cards, having a ton of land, having this little trick with one of my favorite creatures, which is Tireless Tracker. So as if we didn't already have enough card advantage, we bring in Tireless Tracker. So 2 colorless and a green for a 3/2 Human Scout. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, investigate. And when you investigate, you put a colorless clue artifact token onto the battlefield with 2 colorless, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on Tireless Tracker. And that is a 4 of. We are looking to play this on turn 4, and then drop a fetch land, and then basically kind of go from there and really start extending the game with the clues. And the clues are actually much more versatile in this deck, and that is because of the next creature that I'll show you. And this is not a card that shows up in a lot of these lists. It has its own archetype altogether, but I just really like it with Tireless Tracker. And that is Urza, Lord High Artificer. So 2 colorless, 2 blue. 1/4 Legendary Human Artificer. When Urza enters the battlefield, create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Tap an untapped artifact you control, add a blue. Really, really important ability there, almost more important than any of the other abilities. He's kind of like a planeswalker in the sense that it's got 3 different abilities here. And then ultimately on the bottom, 5 colorless, shuffle your library, then exile the top card. Until end of turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. Pretty epic card, obviously. Urza's been in Modern for a little while now. Again, a lot of different decks based around this card. Don't see it too often in a shell like this, I don't think, but I felt it just paired so well with Tireless Tracker. As an example, so, Magical Christmas Land, if you actually get these two on the battlefield at the same time, which is the idea of the deck, either one creates a ton of advantage on their own. Urza's great to be blinked with Yorion. Multiple Tireless Trackers are great, and together they're pretty much unbeatable, because when you play that land and you get that clue, it immediately taps for blue. So essentially, if you play a fetch land, you're going to get 3 mana out of that fetch land, because you're going to get the fetch land in play, which gives you a clue, which can be tapped for a blue. Sack that fetch land for an island or a forest or whatever. You get that land into play, which gives you another clue, which can also be tapped for a blue because of Urza's ability. And then, of course, the land itself taps for a mana. So you essentially get 3 mana just by playing a fetch land. Obviously, that goes a long way for extending the game, creating a ton of advantage further down the game. And sometimes you'll play a game that lasts 9 or 10 turns. You've got 12, 13, 14 mana in play, and you're just going crazy with these 2 cards together. Urza also pairs obviously well with Astrolabe and Gilded Goose, because that generates artifacts, and those foods can be tapped for mana. A lot of the typical Urza lists combine those cards. Another card is Emery, who's really good, but I didn't think I had enough artifacts, obviously, in the deck to really warrant that. But I think that these 2 cards really work well together, and it's a ton of fun to play. You're just churning through your deck. You're playing as many lands as you can. You're playing Grazer to get more lands into play. You're remanning everything to just churn through your deck. Your Archmage is Charming to just churn through your deck. You're protecting your big creatures with Force of Negation backup, and then you get that end game that really kind of solidifies everything. To fuel all these cards and combos, we've got 32 lands, so 48 non-lands, and then 32 lands. So I will start with the fetches, and there are 10 fetch lands, because we want to, again, generate a lot of triggers for Tireless Tracker. So, 4 Misty Rainforest, up next we've got 4 Polluted Delta. So again, we want to grab as many islands as we can because we are a Mystic Sanctuary deck. And we've even got 2 Prismatic Vistas. That could be another blue fetch, I guess, but I felt Prismatic Vista was a good fit in this build. And as I mentioned before, we're aggressively looking for any of the breeding pools in the deck. So we've got the play set of the OG Japanese, which is pretty sweet. Always fun to fetch for those. And then as I mentioned earlier, a couple different times, we are, again, a Mystic Sanctuary deck. When this card was first revealed, I immediately recognized the synergy with fetch lands and the fact it's an island. I think everybody who is familiar with modern and extended formats, things like that, they immediately recognize that connection, and it's proved to be very, very powerful in modern and other formats. I certainly hope this doesn't get banned. That would be a pretty silly card to ban, in my opinion, but again, it's on the chopping block, I believe, in some people's eyes. So 3 potential different cards from this deck: Astrolabe, Uro, and Mystic Sanctuary. But hopefully they leave this card alone because I really like it. I don't even think it's really been tapped for its full potential yet either. Obviously, a lot of people like to play it with the Archmage's Charm, the Cryptic Command, that sort of thing. Deprive is another amazing counterspell that pairs really well with this. There's a Deprive lock that you can establish, but that has kind of fallen off the radar a little bit, even though I think it's pretty powerful in like a pure control shell. Pretty much locks your opponent out of the game. It's just really not a lot of fun to play and can be pretty slow and grindy, but a deck like this is a little bit more aggressive. We're really trying to get out there early. We're getting Mystic Sanctuary value as early and often as possible. Because ultimately, our big hit is going to be Yorion. So we're not so worried about like chaining together multiple Mystic Sanctuaries. That's kind of like just early value and selection. We want to hit Yorion eventually, and that really wins us the game. But Mystic Sanctuary, amazing card. Again, when it enters if you're not familiar, when it enters the battlefield untapped, because you control 3 or more other islands, Mystic Sanctuary will enter untapped, and then you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. So, just amazing versatility there. And you might notice, actually, speaking of instants and sorceries in the graveyard, one card that is absent from this deck is Snapcaster. And as a long-time modern player, especially blue, I had a hard time building a blue deck that didn't have Snapcaster Mage. It didn't feel right, but after playing the deck, I understand it. It would probably still be okay as like a 2-of, if you had to maybe substitute it for something, or maybe even trimming an Urza and a tracker for a couple Snapcasters is a good call. I haven't tested it that way, and I could certainly see it being okay, but, blinking a Snapcaster in this deck with Yorion might seem okay, but it's really not going to do a whole lot because we don't have things like Opt or Serum Visions, and a lot of the cards that we play are actually permanents, and Snapcaster doesn't really pair well with permanent cards in the graveyard. So the only real value that we get out of it is from Remand, Archmage's Charm, Cryptic Command, and maybe Snapcaster Force Negation, but even that's a pretty limited play. All right, so back to lands. So that's why there's no Snapcaster in this blue deck. But next up for lands, we've got 2 Field of Ruin. So just to blow up lands, help us fix our mana, grab that extra island that we might need. Also, obviously, when that land comes into play, if we've got a tracker, we're going to get a clue out of it. Excuse me, I had to take a drink there. Okay. Next up, we've got 4 spicy singleton lands. So, starting off with Waterlogged Grove, just a 1-of. I don't want to take too much damage from tapping for a blue or a green, and we already have a ton of card advantage in this deck and card draw, but I still think it's such a good card that in an 80-card deck you can't really deny it, especially being in the Simic colors, and you can do some interesting things with this card at certain times in the game with when you want to draw that card. So with Mystic Sanctuary and things like that, if you can fetch into Mystic Sanctuary, put that card on top, and then draw to instant speed with Waterlogged Grove. That can prove to be a pretty good combination. So one of Waterlogged Grove. Then we've got one of Oboro Palace in the Clouds. Legendary land, taps for a blue, and then you can pay a colorless and return it to its owner's hand. So this not only works well with Tireless Tracker, obviously, because you can just bring it back to your hand, play it again, get another clue, and keep going, but it also gets around to something like Choke, which admittedly is a pain in the butt for any blue deck that runs a lot of islands in Mystic Sanctuary. But this is technically not an island, so it gets around Choke. At the same time, though, double-edged sword because it actually doesn't count as an island for Mystic Sanctuary. So, but I still think it's a great card, and again, it's just a one of. Next up, we've got Mystic Sanctuary's buddy from Throne of Eldraine, the Gingerbread Cabin. So similar restriction where I need 3 other forests for it to enter untapped, but when it does, what do you know? I create a food token. So that pairs well with Gilded Goose. That food token can be tapped for a mana with Urza, and then of course it can just gain some life. This card has actually proved to be pretty good. It rarely enters tapped. I can fetch for it with a Misty Rainforest, and overall I don't think it's a drawback by any means, especially only having one of. And I have enough forests where I can usually get it to trigger, so that works well. And then even spicier yet is the Simic Growth Chamber. So this is an old school, what we call bounce land. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it comes into play, or enters the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand, but it taps for a green and a blue. So if you're a commander player, you're probably very familiar with this, and even maybe from some Fringe Modern lists, and of course the Amulet Titan decks, which run a ton of these. So if you're familiar with bounce lands, you kind of know some of the versatility that they have with things like Mystic Sanctuary, Gingerbread Cabin, obviously Tireless Tracker, just going to get more land drop triggers, more landfall triggers. So pretty fun, spicy one of there, and honestly it has not been a drawback yet for when I played the deck. It's actually just a fun inclusion. And then next up we've got basic lands. So we're running 2 basic forests, and then we've got 6, or I'm sorry, not basic forests, but basic snow-covered forests, and then 6 basic snow-covered islands. And that just helps fuel Mystic Sanctuary. Snow-covered forests help fuel the Gingerbread Cabin, combined with Breeding Pool, of course, and that usually works out to be plenty of islands and forests in the deck because we're just drawing so many cards and churning through the deck. So as far as the deck itself, I don't have much of a sideboard, honestly, because I haven't really been able to play this very much, in person, obviously, because of the pandemic and whatnot. But for a sideboard, I know that there would be some number of this card, because this is another one of my favorite cards in Modern, Veil of Summer. So, obviously in blue, we've got a ton of options, but this is such a good card, you can't really deny it if you're playing even Simic with blue, for counter magic and things like that. Veil of Summer is just so good for that 1 green mana, and you can really catch some people off guard. Especially in a blue deck, they might think, oh, all their islands are tapped. Let me just play around Force of Negation, or nothing at all, and then suddenly your forest is tapping for a Veil of Summer. And it totally catches them off guard. So, really good card. Other than that, sideboard is pretty much up for grabs and up in the air at this point. But I hope you guys enjoyed the deck tech. It was an 80-card deck, so the deck tech went a little bit long, but super fun deck to play. I'd encourage you to run it on MTGO if you can, if it's not banned, I guess. And again, speaking of that, we will follow up with this deck if there is some sort of ban and restricted update that nerfs this deck in some way. If they take away one of those key cards that we really like, we're going to have to try to reformat it and come up with something else in Simic. But I don't think Urza or Tireless Tracker are going anywhere, so the core idea of the deck is actually still going to remain intact. It's just what's the shell going to look like that surrounds it. So thank you again for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content, you want to see more deck techs, go ahead and hit that like button, that subscribe button. Feel free to comment. Let me know some ideas. Let me know what you guys think about Yorion and Companion. I think it's a really fun idea and a fun card to play with, and I had a lot of fun playing this deck, so thanks again for tuning in, and I encourage you to use it. Take care.